morning to everyone, and welcome to Primetime. Primetime at the BU Library is a celebration of the experiences and the accomplishments of Bethel faculty, students, and staff. It's a collaborative project between the Friends of the BU Library, faculty development, and other offices on campus. Most presentations are recorded and can be found in the BU Digital Library. Be sure to check the library's news and events webpage and the BU calendar for what's coming up on the schedule. Join us on Tuesday, November 24th, as we welcome Dr. Bethany Gurdon, Associate Professor of Nursing, who will share her research on the impact of end-of-life decisions by families of blood and marrow transplant patients. Today we welcome Dr. Andrew Bramsen, Assistant Professor of Political Science, as he explores the question, how does popular fantasy literature reflect changes in the perception of authority? So let's welcome Andrew.
Thank you, Jay. Appreciate the introduction. So I'm going to try to stick to my script as much as possible. Otherwise, this will take far too long. So I don't usually read lectures, but I'm going to try to do that mostly today. Let me just start with a quick word about sort of what this project is. This is a project that I hope will one day be a book. It is a very, very long ways from that. It's something I've been thinking about a lot, and I was kind of pushed to develop it a little bit beyond sort of the thoughts swirling in my head to actually put something on paper and start presenting it by going and actually giving a series at a church. Colonial Church invited me to give a 4-part series on faith and politics. I said, well, how about this topic? And they said, yeah, that'd be great. And so that forced me to kind of write some things up over the summer and begin to develop it. And so I just wanted to share with you what I have so far, or at least a shortened version of that, since I'm condensing essentially 4 lectures into one today. This work grew out of 3 areas of my life. One is my focus in my political scientist sort of persona between political regimes and religion, which has gotten me really interested in questions of political authority and what are the foundations of that authority. The second area is my own Christian journey, in which I become increasingly convicted of the need for us as Christ followers to take seriously our obligation to submit to the earthly authorities that the Lord places in our lives. And for me, this most prominently includes sort of my attitudes toward church leaders, toward government leaders, and toward my employer. Third, I'm a big fan of these 4 fantasy series, which the library has kindly put up there for you. And as I've reflected on them, because it turns out you can't actually turn off the political scientist, even when you're having fun and reading fantasy literature, 60 years of PhD study does this to you. I began to see important interactions between what these series were presenting and themes of authority we have in society and sort of our responsibility toward it. And certainly an interesting shift in the way that authority is portrayed. In short, my working argument is that the 2 earlier series, Lord of the Rings and Narnia, reinforce a classic Christian understanding of authority. That is, the idea that authority is God-ordained, is necessary for good human society, and that we as Christ followers are responsible to submit ourselves to it as we submit to God, just as we are to show our love for God by showing our love for our neighbor, our brother, and so on. So they do this even while they acknowledge the many perils of authority in a fallen world. The 2 later series, Harry Potter and Twilight, in contrast, promote a much more contemporary understanding of authority that we have in the West, and I think increasingly in Christian circles too. And this one focuses more on the individual's desires and the individual's actions, and views institutional authority as really an impediment to a good society more than an asset to it. Authorities may be a necessary evil in Harry Potter and Twilight, but they are fundamentally problematic and fundamentally corrupt. And the more you can work around them, the better things will be. At least that's how these series present it. What I think is interesting is that despite these very divergent views on authority, all 4 of these authors promote a traditional Christian moral framework. In terms of the moral values you see in them, they're all pretty similar, I would argue, at base. So let me just provide one evidence for this sort of societal shift that I'm referring to, and then we're going to focus the bulk of the talk on looking at the series. I think that's probably the most interesting part of this, and I hope to get some good feedback on that. I suspect some of you are familiar with these series. It's probably partly why you're here. Let me just say one thing before I give my one piece of sort of societal evidence for the shift in our perceptions of authority. I don't, unfortunately, have time to talk about all 4 of these. I feel a little bad about that because it feels like I kind of misrepresented it. As I began to prepare the actual text of this lecture, I realized if I try to cover all 4, it is going to be so incredibly thin that it won't be good. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to focus on the 2 series that I do think are the greatest. The one in each of the sort of the dyads. So we'll focus on Lord of the Rings and we'll focus on Harry Potter. I'm happy to talk about Twilight and Narnia in the Q&A. I just don't have time to cover all these in the main presentation. And I'm also kind of assuming a basic knowledge of the story arc of these different series, either from the books or from the films, but I hope I built in enough context that even if you don't know the particular story I'm talking about, it will more or less make sense. So that's the hope. Perceptions of institutional authority in the US and in the West more generally have, I think, moved in a definite negative direction in recent decades. A quote from a New York Times opinion piece this July illustrates this point. It says, in 1958, when the American National Election Study first asked Americans if they trusted the government in Washington to do what was right, 73% of adults said they put their faith in the federal government most or some of the time. In 2014, the last time anyone asked this question, the Pew Research Center estimated that roughly 24% of the adult population in the US trusted the federal government to do what was right most or some of the time. So a very big decline, about 3/4 of Americans to about a quarter that really trust the government. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest this is not unique to America, but it's something we have seen in the West more generally, this decline in the trust of institutions. So that's kind of the world we live in. And without further ado, let's get into looking at sort of how this is reflected in literature by looking at our much more traditional pro-authority case, The Lord of the Rings. There's my apology to Narnia and Twilight. J.R. Tolkien's classic is well known for describing the corrupting potential of power. And there's no question this theme is a prominent one in the books. I would argue the movie version disproportionately emphasizes this theme, but it is there in the books as well. It's not, though, the whole story. And it's not even indeed the main thrust in terms of what this book or these books communicate about authority. So let me start by looking at this most obvious of the manifestations of this theme found in the oft-repeated poem at the center of Lord of the Rings. 3 rings for the elven kings under the sky, 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone, 9 for mortal men doomed to die, 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. 1 ring to rule them all, 1 ring to find them, 1 ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them, in the land of Mordor where the shadows lie. Is power, at its core, the power to oppress? Is that what authority is? This poem might suggest the answer is clearly yes. But a careful look at the ring lore shows us the reality is a lot more complicated. So let's think about this in a little bit more detail. The power of the elven rings, first mentioned, can and has been used to create beautiful things and fight for the good. For example, Elrond uses his ring to develop and sustain the peaceful realm of Rivendell, a place of joy for his own people as well as for others in Middle-earth. In a similar way, Galadriel uses her ring to cultivate the heart of Elvendom in Middle-earth, the shatteringly beautiful Lothlorien. While in one sense it seems her husband, Celeborn, is the head of Lothlorien, both by virtue of his maleness, Middle-earth is very traditional in this regard, and by virtue of his seniority, he's also older, it's nonetheless clear because of her ring that she and not he is the true mover and shaker of Lorien. He has authority, but the ring gives her even more. The third elven ring has been given to Gandalf, who's central to this series as he fights, uses its power to fight for the good against the evil. Less details provided about the rings of the dwarves, but it's likewise clear that they are used to develop their craft and to assist their people. Ultimately, these rings are actually captured by Sauron or destroyed, so by the time you get to the trilogy, you don't really see any of them functioning, so there's not much detail given on those. In contrast, the rings given to mortal men were designed to allow them to exercise power over their people. And so these were rings of domination, and they ensnared their users. When these men died, they became wraiths who served the evil purposes of the Dark Lord Sauron. The One Ring, made for Sauron's hand alone and wholly evil, as the series says, is similar in its purpose, though even that account of it is somewhat problematized. Since the reader will remember, Bilbo used the ring to accomplish great good and stave off the forces of evil in The Hobbit. So while one of the central themes or repeated themes in the book is that power can corrupt, it does not of necessity do so. While authority can be misused, it can also be used rightly and for great good. And there's a kind of symmetry even in this poem about the rings, in which 10 of the rings, right, 3 for the Elven Kings, 7 for the Dwarf Lords, are used for good, and 10 of them are used for evil, right? 10 show a good use of power, 10 show a corrupt one, where you're trying to dominate the will of others. So let's turn to a consideration of some other examples of the misuse and proper use of authority and power. One of the big themes that we see throughout the series is this recurring theme of whether the temptation to take the ring and to use the ring can and should be resisted. One of the sort of conflicts we see here is between Boromir, the man, and Elrond, the elf. Boromir is a valiant man of Gondor. He offers one answer to this question: should we use the ring? The ring, he argues, is a tool, a gift, in a moment of great adversity. Valor needs first strength and then a weapon. Let the ring be your weapon. If it has such power as you say, take it and go forth to victory. But Elrond responds, we can't use this ring. Its strength, Boromir, is too great for anyone to wield at will, save only those who already have a great power of their own. But for them, it holds an even deadlier peril. The very desire of it corrupts the heart. Nothing is evil in the beginning. Even Sauron was not so. I fear to take the ring to hide it. I will not take the ring to wield it. What is this evil that Elrond is referring to when he's talking about the One Ring? It's the evil that we see in the person of Sauron, right? The desire to dominate others, to take away their freedom, to take away their will, and to force them to serve your own ends. It is clear from what Elrond, Galadriel, and Gandalf, the three holders of the Elven Rings, say that if one of the wise were to take the ring and were to try to use it to beat Sauron, he or she would become a new Dark Lord and would be ensnared by the same desire to misuse power as Sauron was. Now Boromir submits to this guidance at the council, at least officially, but the desire of the ring continues to corrupt his mind. Ultimately, he tries to take it from Frodo, fails, and then dies in a valiant cause after somewhat repenting, perhaps. Others in the series will have the opportunity to seize the ring, and they'll be offered the ring, and they'll refuse to do so, showing that even though this power is great, the wise will turn away from exercising it for a more appropriately limited view of their own authority and their own power. For example, when Frodo offers Galadriel the ring later in the Fellowship of the Ring, she confesses she has desired to have this ring. She's desired it so she can beat Sauron, so she can preserve the good that she's created on Earth, and yet she realizes if she did this, she would not ultimately accomplish her ends, right? She would become a new Dark Lord or a Dark Queen, and would become like Sauron, right? And so she resists this. Sam makes a last-ditch effort to try to persuade Galadriel, and I think it's instructive the way she responds. Sam says, if you'll pardon me speaking out, I think my master was right. I wish you would take his ring. You'd put things to right. You'd make some folk pay for their dirty work. Galadriel, I would. That is how it would begin. But it would not stop with that, alas. We will not speak of it more. Let us go. Galadriel and Boromir have a similar desire in their desire to use the ring. They both want to save the weak. They both want to help people under their care. And they both have some desire for rightly ordered authority, right? But their conclusions are different. Boromir succumbs to this power thinking, I can do sort of evil that good may come. And Galadriel realizes that is a very dangerous temptation, right? That you can't do it. You will succumb and you will become the evil that you're trying to defeat. Tolkien clearly communicates throughout the series that different peoples of Middle-earth, including wizards, men, and hobbits, can fall to the ring and they can also resist it. We see this in the wizards with Gandalf, who refuses the ring, and Saruman, who ruins himself seeking it. We see this with hobbits in the person of Bilbo, who gains the ring, yet exercises pity in doing so, and later yields the ring up more or less willingly. And in contrast, in the person of Gollum, or Smeagol, a hobbit who gained the ring by murder and was wholly corrupted by it. We also see it with men. And one of the big contrasts is with Boromir and his brother Faramir. Faramir has an opportunity to seize the ring, a much better opportunity than Boromir had. And yet, when he has that moment, right, he refuses to do so. Now, if you watch the movies, you might think he actually was corrupted by the ring. That's wrong. The movie's portrayal of Faramir is just abysmal. My wife and I, this is the moment we get the angriest in the movies, pretty much, is when the Faramir moment is like, no, stop, you're running Faramir, right? Faramir in the books immediately refuses it. He says, I'm wise enough to know there are some perils from which a man must flee, right? I can't do this. This ring would corrupt me, and I'm not going to take it, right? And so he refuses very strongly. Likewise, Aragorn could have seized the ring, and he would have been able to wield its power effectively. He's one of those Elrond mentioned who had that great power in himself, who could dominate the ring, and yet he also knows that it would ultimately corrupt him too and cause him to use power in destructive ways. Legolas later comments of him, in that hour I looked on Aragorn, and I thought how great and terrible a lord he might have become in the strength of his will had he taken the ring to himself. Not for naught does Mordor fear him, but nobler is his spirit than the understanding of Sauron, right? He's not going to go down the path Sauron did and dominate the will of others. So what's the point here? All this resistance really points to a lack of authority, to a lack of authority on the part of leaders such as Aragorn and Galadriel, but to a desire for right authority. In other words, not an authority that shows a desire to dominate others, to take away their will, take away their freedom, to force them to serve your own ends, but an authority that seeks their good and seeks to exercise that authority for their benefit. And that kind of authority, Tolkien wants to tell us, is absolutely essential. You have to have it or society will not function well. You can see this need for proper authority when Denethor, the steward of Gondor, despairs while the city of Minas Tirith is under attack. And he abdicates his responsibility to govern. He just goes and sits by his son's bed because Faramir is desperately ill. Gandalf steps into the breach and he organizes the defense of the city with the clear motivation not to seize power, not to dominate, right, but to save the lives of the men of Minas Tirith. So the issue is not with authority or with power, but with how it's used. What is the end that it is seeking? Now, Tolkien's not dodging this issue. He knows power is dangerous, and he acknowledges this, and he explores the significance of this, right? One of the places I think is really interesting that he explores it is in the Two Towers. When Gimli the dwarf finds out Merry and Pippin, the two hobbits they've been trying to rescue, are now with the Ent or tree herder Fangorn, who's also known in the series as Treebeard. If you watch the movies, that's how he's always referred to there, I think. Gimli inquires of Gandalf. He says, "You speak of Treebeard as if he were a friend. I thought he was dangerous." "Dangerous," cries Gandalf, "and so am I. Very dangerous, more dangerous than anything you will ever meet, unless you're brought alive before the seat of the Dark Lord. And Aragorn is dangerous, and Legolas is dangerous. You are beset with dangers, Gimli, son of Glóin, for you are dangerous yourself, in your own fashion. Certainly, the forest of Fangorn is perilous, and Fangorn himself, he is perilous too, yet he is wise and he is kindly, nonetheless." So power and authority are dangerous for Tolkien, but they're also necessary, and they're also good. It's often made clear in the series that Middle-earth during Lord of the Rings has been in a long period of decline. Now, at first glance, especially if you've only watched the movies, you might think that's because Sauron has come and he's dominating and that's a problem, and that's part of the story. But a careful examination shows this has a lot more to do with a failure of positive authority, a weak authority that exists among, in particular, the men. At the Council of Elrond in the Fellowship of the Ring, Elrond talks about the greatness of men. And he talks also about their long, slow decline, especially with the loss of the kingship. Boromir, who's after all the son of the ruling steward, the stewards rule since the king is absent, and heir to the stewardship of Gondor, defends his realm. And he talks about the great good it continues to do in defending other peoples against Sauron's evil. And yet he also concedes, as he's talking to Elrond, that our defense is weakening, and our efforts to accomplish that good are beginning to fail. And so he tacitly concedes to Elrond's critique, right? The answer, I think, lies in the return of the king, found in the person of Aragorn, who has been carrying out a similar work of defense in the north of Middle-earth, where he protects the land of the hobbits, even as Gondor defends the south. Yet Aragorn longs to return to his own land and to restore her to greatness. Gondor's need for her king is, I think, well seen in the reader's first glimpse of her main city, Minas Tirith. We see it through the eyes of Pippin, the hobbit, who arrives there with Gandalf. Pippin is in Gondor and Minas Tirith for the very first time, and as he observes, he sees both greatness and he sees decay. Let me just read part of the quote I have up there and you can see the rest of it. Pippin gazed in growing wonder at the great stone city, vaster and more splendid than anything he had dreamed of. Yet it was in truth falling year by year into decay, and already it lacked half the men that could have dwelt in ease there. So we see this sort of like what remains after a great authority had governed, and yet we see it crumbling because the good authority has largely disappeared. Pippin and Gandalf then go up to see the ruling steward, Denethor, and Pippin observes a dead tree that is kept there in honor. The tree is, in a tragic way, a great thing. It remains a sort of symbol of the kingdom that was. But it is a symbol of what was and maybe what could be, and not what is, since the tree is in fact dead. The wrong use of authority is summed up well by Gandalf when he comments on his former wizarding colleague Saruman, who's gone over to the evil side, that he will not serve, he will only command. True authority stands in stark contrast to this. It exercises its power strongly, yes. It establishes and enforces laws, yes. But it does so out of a desire to serve, not to dominate others. It is in harmony with nature, not in tension with it. Unlike Sauron, who just lays waste to the landscape, the good is always going to be in harmony with nature, a big theme in Tolkien, something he also took very seriously in his own life. This point is symbolized, I think, when Aragorn finds another sapling of the sacred tree of Gondor, and he replants it. And they bury the old dead tree in honor, and they plant this new tree, and you can see sort of the symbol of the kingdom growing anew. And it's this kind of authority Aragorn exercises in his restored kingdom. He establishes the rule of law, and he follows it himself. For example, after he's reestablished himself, he made a law saying that men cannot go into the land of the hobbits, right? You're going to keep this land for the hobbits so they can live at peace without the interference of the big people, as they call them, right? And so when he wishes to visit them, he obeys his own law. He only goes as far as the border, and the hobbits come out to see him, right? He doesn't go in there, he doesn't break his own law. We also see him accepting the glory and the majesty of the throne and sort of this full authority that's bestowed on him, but he bows before Frodo and he bows before Sam after their successful quest to destroy the ring. And he asks Frodo and he asks Gandalf to assist in his coronation, a humble acknowledgement of his indebtedness to them for the authority that he is now exercising. And while he accepts his rightful rule from the hand of the steward, Faramir, he also affirms Faramir's stewardship and asks that he continue in it. It doesn't seem as some sort of threat to his authority, right? This is another way of exercising authority well. There's a lot more we could say about authority in Lord of the Rings. We could go on and well beyond one session in the library. But we need to turn now to Harry Potter. And so let me do that and just kind of sum this up really quickly here, right? For Tolkien, true authority does not desire to dominate others. It does not want to take away their freedom. It does not want to force them to serve your own ends. It seeks their good and it's exercised for their benefit. Tolkien sees the peril of authority. He sees the problem, but he also sees the great good that can come from it and the inability to achieve that good without proper authority. And that's a huge theme for Tolkien. You can't have the good we should have unless you have proper authority. It's absolutely essential. So that brings us to Harry Potter. And here we're going to see a very different story. The disrespect for and the failing of institutional authority is apparent, I think, throughout these books. And it starts with the very first mention of the Ministry of Magic. I'm not actually going to read this quote, just talk about it, but I wanted to put it up there for you. So the first mention of Ministry of Magic occurs very early in the Sorcerer's Stone, the first book in the series, when Harry's just beginning to learn about the wizarding world, and we as the readers are learning along with him. You can see the quote on the screen, and what it establishes in short is that while there is an institutional authority, its usual is to mess things up. And it's run not by competent leaders, but by incompetents, who always need to seek advice from someone outside that institutional authority. And even that advice is not enough to keep them from messing up, right? So they still screw it up even if they have good advice from the outside. So that's how bad institutional authority is. That's our first impression as we read Harry Potter. The Ministry of Magic in these books has a twofold purpose. Its main purpose is to be sure that the fact that there is such a thing as a wizarding world, there are witches and wizards running around, is kept secret from muggles. There's people like us, non-magic folk, right? Its secondary purpose is to make sure that magic is used in ways that are not harmful, both to members of the magical community and into the larger muggle community as well. So the Ministry is always attempting to stop those who play tricks on muggles, to clean up the messes that ensue when they don't stop them in time, and to right the wrongs, erase memories, and so forth. Despite often looking quite blundering, the Ministry has largely succeeded in its first purpose, to keep people like us from knowing that it exists, right? Given that the books consistently portray muggles as idiotic in comparison with witches and wizards, I'm not sure how impressive this is. It's like, yes, you dominate all of us, stupid people, right? Good for you, right? But that doesn't necessarily mean you're particularly competent. It doesn't seem like a very high bar. It's sort of like, taking candy from a 2-year-old. The Ministry's success at law enforcement and preventing misuse of wizardry is much more mixed, as the evil Lord Voldemort's power suggests, both before the time period covered in these books and as he arises anew in these books. One of the key sub-themes in the Harry Potter series is that rules are often an obstacle to doing what is right and to achieving desirable ends. So this is in stark contrast to Tolkien's and Lewis's works, in which proper authority and right submission provide the freedom necessary to accomplish the good. In Rowling's world, authority and submission to its dictates more often than not stand in the way of your freedom and keep you from accomplishing good objectives. Breaking the rules to achieve a good end is an important theme in each of the first 3 Harry Potter books. In each of these, some kind of reprimand is given to the culprits after they break the rules and essentially save the world, right? But then they get much higher praise. But this was a necessary breaking of the rules, and so good for you, right? So the admonition is much lower than the praise they receive. And you see this trend continue in the later books, although the rule breaking becomes a little less successful as the series goes along, which is interesting. I can elaborate more on the rule breaking as good dynamic in the Q&A if you want to, but for now I'm going to focus more specifically on how the governing authority itself is corrupted. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic in the first 5 books of the series, is a big example and main example of this kind of corruption. In his initial appearance in person, which happens in the second book in the series, he shows up at Hogwarts to arrest the gamekeeper Hagrid for allegedly attacking Muggleborns at Hogwarts. Dumbledore staunchly disagrees with the charge and repeatedly informs Fudge, this is wrong, you're making the wrong decision. Fudge doesn't even really disagree with the facts, right? He just sort of excuses his behavior by saying, I'm under a lot of pressure, gotta be seen to be doing something, right? It's the sort of worst of all political impulses. Now, while doing the wrong thing is rarely known to really help leaders, Fudge commits to doing precisely that, and it quickly becomes apparent he's wrong and Dumbledore's right. Now, Fudge is at times benevolent. At times he does seem to look out for Harry, particularly at the beginning of Prisoner of Azkaban, the third book. But on the whole, he's a classically inefficient and easily corrupted bureaucrat. For example, later in that same book, The Prisoner of Azkaban, Fudge approves the execution of a magical animal simply because Lucius Malfoy, a wealthy and prominent wizard, is pressuring him to do so. Fudge goes so far as to show up at the animal's farce of an appeal with an executioner so that he can carry out the penalty immediately after they've gone through the legal niceties of pretending that this animal has a chance to live. Later in the same book, Fudge will refuse to listen to Harry's arguments that he was wrong about the alleged criminal Sirius Black, Harry's godfather. And instead of investigating the matter carefully, he authorizes an immediate Dementor's kiss for Black so that his soul will be sucked out, thereby bringing an end to the matter. In the end, the outcome is avoided, although in the next book, the kiss is carried out on another prisoner in a way that perverts the course of justice and delays recognition of the return of Lord Voldemort. Lord Voldemort's comeback is another area in which Fudge demonstrates his incompetence and his corruption. Despite mounting evidence of Voldemort's return, Fudge refuses to admit this, covers up all evidence to the contrary, and denounces people like Harry and Dumbledore who challenge him. Fudge refuses to acknowledge Voldemort's comeback as a result of his fear of losing his own power and of being seen as incompetent, since the failure to prevent this comeback will fall on him and on the ministry he leads. Thus, rather than seeking the good of those in the wizarding community, Fudge is seeking to protect his own position. That's his goal. Harry's dealings with the Ministry of Magic's bureaucracy likewise inspire very little confidence in institutional authority. The ministry is quick to condemn him for improper use of magic as an underage wizard on 2 occasions, even though on the first occasion he didn't even do it. It was a house elf. Given that the house elf magic is accomplished without the use of wands, this always puzzles me why they can't tell the difference. You'd think wizards would be better than this, but for some reason they can't. On the second occasion, Harry did do the magic. He is guilty, but he did it to save his life and that of his Muggle cousin from a Dementor attack. So, kind of justifiable, right? The sort of classic self-defense argument. Despite these clear circumstances, he's subjected to a full trial in which his acquittal really seems to hang in the balance. In the end, Dumbledore is able to persuade them to let him off. During this trial, the ministry changes the time, they change the place at the last minute to try to cause Harry and Dumbledore to miss it. Thanks to the fact that they are expecting such tricks from the ministry, they don't miss it. And they also belittle the one eyewitness that they have to this event, and they decline to interview another relevant witness who Dumbledore offers to summon immediately. Unlike in our world, that's actually a literal offer in Harry Potter, right? You can actually summon them immediately. So in short, justice is not really paramount to the authorities in this world. What's interesting, of course, is there are a couple other occasions when Harry illegally uses magic and is not charged. So in the first, he blows up his step-aunt like a balloon, right? And the ministry excuses his behavior without any questions at all, because they're very anxious at that point in time to protect him from Sirius Black. On a second occasion, he defends himself against people, some of Voldemort's supporters of Voldemort himself, who are attacking him, and the ministry doesn't talk about that either because they don't want to admit Voldemort's back, right? They're trying to cover that up, and so you can't really charge Harry without admitting why he was doing magic, and so therefore they decline to do that. So all this record of inconsistency, I think, shows the arbitrary nature of ministry of justice and of due process. The weakness of institutional authority in the wizarding world can also be seen in the tremendous power wielded by those who are outside the system. And that's really where the strongest powers seem to lie. Dumbledore is powerful and influential in the wizarding world, but he steadfastly refuses to serve as Minister of Magic. He's apparently turned down the position at least 3 different times. Excuse me. It becomes apparent over time that this is at least partly because Dumbledore fears how well he would handle power and influence. And that brings us to this quote. So after recounting his own early desires for power, and his failure that led to the death of his sister, the following conversation ensues between Dumbledore and Harry. This is what he says. Dumbledore says, I was offered the post of Minister of Magic, not once, but several times. Naturally, I refused. I had learned I was not to be trusted with power. But you'd have been better, much better, than Fudge or Scrimgeour, burst out Harry. Would I? Asked Dumbledore heavily. I'm not so sure. I had proven as a very young man, power was my weakness and my temptation. It is a curious thing, Harry, but perhaps those who are best suited to power are those who have never sought it. Now, Dumbledore's position on this is somewhat ironic, both because he was offered but refused the ministry position even though he did not seek it, and because he does agree to serve in other powerful positions, like the head of the Wizengamot, the High Court of Wizardom, and as the headmaster of Hogwarts, right? And he continues to exercise a considerable informal authority in the wizarding world. He's the one that people look to in moments of crises, right? So it doesn't seem to really diminish his power or his authority at all. It's just he's outside the institutional structure. That seems to be the big difference, right? And so what it does is not really reduce his authority, right? It reduces the institutional authority by putting the strongest players outside that system. That's the functional end of what he does. Now, Dumbledore is still a good character. He's doing what he's doing in an effort to seek the good and see it come to fruition. Lord Voldemort, on the other hand, is the opposite. He's this sort of fundamentally evil character of the series. And he also largely acts outside of institutional channels in his pursuit of much more nefarious ends. Voldemort's desire for power trumps everything else, a point that is made abundantly clear throughout the books. He does not care who he has to kill or who he has to destroy to get power. He does not care about lesser beings, which to him includes all non-wizards and all muggle-born wizards. He does not, despite his obsession with power, upon graduating from Hogwarts, Voldemort does not seek a position in the ministry. You'd think that would be the obvious path, right? He loves power, he's obsessed with power, so get into the power structure, work your way out, take over, and rule the world, right? But he doesn't do that, right? He operates outside that institutional structure, pursuing his own path, using his sort of personal charisma and his personal skills to pursue his plans, not through the existing institutions of authority. So for good and for ill, respectively, Dumbledore and Voldemort illustrate the wizarding world's tendency to focus on charismatic authority more than on institutional authority. All right, so let me sum up. For Rowling, institutional authority is weak, and it's an obstacle to accomplishing good much more than it is a facilitator of it. In contrast, Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia express a high view of authority, not as an obstacle to freedom, but as a facilitator of it. Only when authority is in place and being properly exercised can true freedom occur. Both of these series see the problems with authority gone awry. And yet, having proper authority is so important for accomplishing the good, it is worth that risk. In fact, questioning that point or suggesting otherwise, suggesting you might somehow do without this authority, is really not on the table in Lord of the Rings or in Narnia. In contrast, of course, the picture of authority in Harry Potter and in Twilight is much more akin to our deeply skeptical contemporary view of institutionalized authority as mostly corrupt, mostly problematic, something we mostly do not trust. You can't dispense with it altogether, right? They don't really try to do that in either Harry Potter or Twilight. But insofar as there's any kind of really good authority in these works, and in these worlds, it's really based on personal charisma, personal legitimacy, not sort of the institutions that you are a part of. I think that's just in stark contrast with the portrayal of institutional authority as a positive good in Lord of the Rings and Narnia, a view that's much more in keeping with the classic Christian understanding of how we should view and relate to authority. In other words, as having been ordained by God, with us having a responsibility to submit to it as we submit to God himself. So we can see the modern move in these more recent literary works, and thus we can see our own contemporary view of authority in a mirror, and perhaps, I would suggest, the view of many of us as Western Christians as well. So with that, I hope I've conveyed at least a basic comparison and a basic impression of what I'm working on. I'll stop there. I'll be happy to field questions on any of what I've talked about, or on sort of tying this to the two series I did not get a chance to cover. So thank you for your good attention. Questions? Yes.
So what do you do with the mixture of authority figures within Hogwarts between kind of the competent and respected Dumbledore and McGonagall, and then like Filch, that is technically an authority figure but nobody takes seriously or listens to it?
Yeah, I mean, so thinking about authority within Hogwarts, I thought more about the government side than the sort of the educational context, because there is a high respect for Dumbledore in that context, right? Sort of as an educational figure. It really, again, seems to come down to sort of this personal legitimacy, right? I mean, that Dumbledore's respect is largely because not because he's headmaster, but because he's Dumbledore, because of who he is. Filch is not respected. I mean, Filch is a squib for one thing. He doesn't actually have magical powers. Big embarrassing point for him, right? And also, he's just a mean and nasty person, right? He's always kind of up with more rules, right? He's sort of the rule maker par excellence, right? And most of them seem to be pointless and unnecessary. So he has no legitimacy personally, and therefore nobody respects him. And I think you can see that when Snape becomes headmaster in the final book, he does not get the level of respect from most of the students and faculty at Hogwarts that Dumbledore had, in part because largely I think because his personal legitimacy and likability are so much lower. So yeah, good question. Other questions? Yeah, Abby.
What made you choose these series, like in particular? Were there any other series that you like kind of thought about talking about?
Yeah, that's a good question. So part of it is really not very academic and scientific at all. I know these series. I love them. I've thought about them a lot. So that's sort of why they were at the forefront of my mind. Did I think about other series? The main other one I did think about, and Warren and I had a discussion of this, was Hunger Games. And I don't know if I might loop that in somewhere along the way. The problem with Hunger Games is that it's dystopian. And so in dystopian novels, authority is always portrayed badly. There's no such thing as good authority in a dystopian novel. At least if you're aware of an exception, let me know, but I can't think of any. Authority is always sort of fundamentally corrupt and problematic in those contexts. But it still might be interesting to kind of tie that back in in some way. But it's a very different context. But no, I mean, like these were the sort of the four that seemed to me to show this tendency. And frankly, if I do end up writing a book on this, I think probably these four will be more than enough to deal with. So I'll probably stick there. But if you have any others that you would think I should think about, I'd be interested to talk about that. Jeff?
These are worlds created by their authors, right?
Yes.
What is the difference between authors' motivation? The first two, probably authors are trying to do a social good, trying to convey society, which probably is ideal. The other two are trying to make a commercial gain out of selling series, being the base of the passions of people. So, any thoughts on motivations of authors in the worlds they create?
Yeah, I mean, that may be true. I guess maybe I have a more idealistic view of what these authors are trying to do. I mean, I do think that these are all, to varying degrees, I would put this one a little lower again, but to varying degrees, they're all really good storytellers, right? They're people who have a powerful ability to tell a story. I'm not convinced that you can write a good series just because you want to make money. You have to have something, there has to be the muse, right? I mean, you have to be able to come up with something that is compelling and that people want to read. And I think, while certainly the sort of the deep Christian faith of Lewis and Tolkien does infuse their works, I don't think that's why they wrote it. Especially with Tolkien, I don't think that's why he wrote it. His explanation of his motivations in the sort of the prologue to Lord of the Rings is that this is the work of a storyteller trying to take his hands and telling a really long story and seeing if people will be interested in it. Certainly their values infuse that. So I don't see as much of a tension there. I also think that it's interesting, and I've talked about this elsewhere actually, but there's a lot of ties between Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter thematically, right? In part, I think because Rowling is a pretty big Lord of the Rings fan, and so there's a ton of parallels between those two. And a lot of the sort of theological insights of Tolkien, which I think he gets from Catholic theology largely, bleed over into Rowling's work. And I suspect she gets that from him. So I'd be interested to hear if you think there really is a big sort of difference there that is important to follow. I haven't seen anything that I would look at and say that's a definite sort of issue I would focus on. But again, if you have something to talk about, I'd be interested to hear that. Pretty good. Yes.
I found your statistic in the beginning really fascinating about the decline of respect of authority. It's sort of opposite of the incline of YA as a genre. YA has kind of really skyrocketed since the 1970s. Sure. And I wonder, YA is all about talking about difficult things, challenging authority, as teenagers are developing and becoming bolder with their feelings. And I'm wondering if that's what these books are kind of that's why they're challenging authority, or if there's something deeper and more American about it, or something else in the psychology of it. And I wonder if in adult fiction you found some themes, or if it's just in YA that we recognize these themes.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think these themes are present more broadly, because I think this is not just a youth thing, right? It's society more broadly becoming skeptical. I guess I would focus. I think there's a lot of reasons why respect for authority is declining, and in this country, a lot of very good reasons. You can in the U.S., one of the places you can sort of trace a lot of it to, I think, is sort of the double whammy of Vietnam, right, which really caused a huge decline in trust in the government, followed by Watergate, right, or kind of parallel with Watergate, which really caused people to lose confidence. So I think there's probably some connection to what's going on in the world and those themes that are going to emerge in youth fiction. But yeah, I don't know if that gets to your question. Do you want to follow up on that? Or, okay. So yeah, let's see, Dylan.
So in the Silmarillion, you find out that there's the head gods, Eru and the Valar, and Manwë at the top of them.
Right.
So even though they're not really mentioned in once you get to the Fellowship or the trilogy, how do you see the power and authority of God and the gods evidenced in the books?
In the Lord of the Rings.
That's right.
Yeah. It's very indirect, right? There are critical moments, I think, where it emerges, and it's really important. But Tolkien was very, very careful that he did not want to write an allegory. He did not. I think he was very critical of Lewis actually on this. That Lewis is much too transparent, right? Sort of Aslan is Christ dynamic, right? It's just way too much hitting you over the head for Tolkien, right? He wanted to be much more subtle. He wanted his world to be different. But I do see sort of those moments where they rely on the divine, right? Essentially on God, even though he's not mentioned in so many words, right? So, for example, in the when Frodo and Sam are trying to make it through the tunnel of Shelob, right? And they are appealing for divine intervention, right? When they're attacked on the on Weathertop by the Dark Riders, right? They appeal he appeals, he cries out for Elbereth, right? And so there are moments where you see that, but it's very subtle. It's very subtle. And there's not. You would expect it to come up maybe like the Council of Elrond. Right? Oh, okay, we have these divinities, and we should maybe appeal to them. And there's really not that. So he tries to make it very subtle, but I think there are moments of crisis when we see them feel it. But yeah, it's much more subtle than it is in what I know of the Silmarillion. I confess, I still have not made it through the whole Silmarillion. I would get bogged down. It's too many names in place. But I love the creation accounts in there. But after that, it gets to be a very hard slog. So yeah, good question. Yes, I'll say a question here.
Yeah, I couldn't remember if you said that the statistic was that a United States statistic, because
It is,
I just was wondering if you addressed to all that 3 of these authors are British,
Right.
and they're...
Yeah, and I just used that. That was one of the sort of most recent and easy to use short clips for this presentation. There's evidence to suggest the same thing is happening in Britain. And I think in the West more generally, that's been the case. Now, if we went to outside of the West, I think this story gets a little different. But these are Western works and largely written for a Western audience. So I think this is a Western thing. I focus on the U.S. because that's where we are. But yes, you get the same kind of decline in trust in the institution going on in Britain as well. Yeah, it's a really good question, Chris.
This might actually follow that. What do you think of the fact that at the end of the Harry Potter saga, Harry and Hermione are still working for the University?
Yeah.
We'll hear more in the play, I think, that's coming out this spring. It doesn't sound like he's necessarily satisfied with the job.
Right.
But isn't that still a fairly traditional British trajectory? You go to your public school and you wind up getting a network.
Yeah.
She's been criticized for having this overly bureaucratized universe.
Right. Yeah, it's weird because what are your options in the wizarding world for work? I mean, it's not clear what most of them, like, you can work for the Ministry of Magic, you can run a shop on Diagon Alley, you can do something shady. It's not clear to me what else you can really do. There don't seem to be much in the way of farmers and things like that in the wizarding world. So, yeah, I think it seems like the most inspirational thing for them to do to Rowling. But yeah, it is interesting that they kind of joined with that. And you get this vague sense at the end of the series, like maybe things are going to get better. I mean, Kingsley Shacklebolt gets named, the Minister of Magic, and we're kind of deeply sympathetic with him. And Hermione's going to go join in with us, and Harry's going to go join in with us. But yeah, it's very vague. I mean, like all the sort of corruption narrative is very well developed, and then at the end we just sort of get this thing. And they did this and this and this, and we're done. So yeah, it's interesting, but it is a very traditional sort of British,
Clearly, you should have majored in history, but they could have done any job.
What's that?
You should have majored in history because then you could have done any job.
That's the thing. And they dropped history and magic, and that was the problem. Unfortunately, Professor Binns was not nearly as engaging as our history faculty.
Thank you.
Any other questions? We're almost out of time. I think I can take one more. Okay, hearing none, I'd be happy to chat with you more afterwards, but thank you for your attention. Thank you for attending, and hope you have a good rest of the day.